The basic insight of modern social science is that so many of the things which we think are personal, just about our life and our relationships and so on, are actually deeply shaped by structural forces. Your own opportunities to get a job, to get an income, to get a decent home. It's a delusion to believe that you're in control, that your private life is the totality of your life. You're part of a system.
So Geoff Mulgan is a leader. Right now, he's Professor of Collective Intelligence, Public Policy and Social Innovation at University College London. He has had an amazing career serving citizens in Great Britain and around the world. He previously held a role at Nesta as its CEO, which is the UK's innovation foundation, and he also was at the heart of government, holding influential roles between 1997 and 2004, such as the Director of the Government Strategy Unit and the Performance and Innovation Unit, alongside being Head of Policy in the Prime Minister's office. He served as Demos' first director and the first CEO of the Young Foundation. In 2020, he was knighted in recognition of the important contributions he has made to society.
I find some very clever people get into the view that you can't change the very local stuff without changing the whole system. So they say, unless we overthrow capitalism, it's all a waste of time. And particularly in universities, you get quite a lot of that. And it becomes, at its extreme, an excuse for complete inaction, basically. I think it's an indulgence of the, and a lot of the intellectuals get into this space.
Classic ivory tower.
A pure ivory tower.
Geoff, thank you so much for joining us at the School of Social Justice video podcast. I'm really happy to have you here. I've been really looking forward to this conversation simply because I've been watching you and working alongside you over the years since we met way back in 2008 on the Uprising Leadership Programme, which in many ways pushed me to figure out my own way of contributing to society and addressing the social injustices of which we'll talk today, and inspired me in many ways to set up the School of Social Justice. Not only have you been a social entrepreneur, but also an academic and also somebody who is at the heart of government, making strategic decisions about the country in which we live in. And so there's so much for our students to learn from you today. So I can't wait to get stuck in. As I say, welcome to the school.
Thank you, Evan. It's great what you're doing. And I hope I can share some thoughts or prompts at least. Yeah,
I'm 100% sure. I mean, first off, to start off with, it would be great to learn about what you're up to now. Of course, you've had a long career, which I've described so far, very varied with different kinds of roles and positions. But what is your focus currently at UCL as a professor?
So and you are here in an engineering department, which may surprise you. And I'm sort of immersed in people working on science, technology, engineering, and public policy. But a lot of, in fact, what we're working on relates to you. So one of the things I run is called the International Public Policy Observatory. And over the next 2 years, we're working on both inequality as one of our priorities, working with the 4 governments of the UK. What are the next sort of challenges and what's the evidence of what you could do on different kinds of inequality. We're also looking at spatial inequality, what you can do about the huge differences between places in terms of life opportunities. I spent the last 2 weeks in Australia, partly with their government, Prime Ministers and Cabinet, which is a new, quite energetic government in place, and with a foundation called the Paul Ramsay Foundation, which is the biggest foundation in the Southern Hemisphere, whose primary task is focusing on cycles of disadvantage and how you stop them. So issues of justice, inequality are very much in my head. And I guess my career has been a kind of slightly messy mix of sometimes working very top down in governments, so here in the UK, but also in Australia, Canada, Singapore, elsewhere. Sometimes bottom up, working on community projects and campaigns and social enterprises. And then a bit in between running foundations like Nesta and here as an academic.
Yes, so much there. And I mean, given all of that experience, how would you personally describe social justice? There are so many different definitions, but before we get into it, what are we talking about here?
I don't know, I was thinking about this. When I was a teenager, I became an activist, quite an angry activist on many fronts. And in some ways, I think it's easier to see and describe injustice. As humans, we're very well programmed, almost wired to spot unfairness, people being mistreated. And we experience that emotionally. As it were, justice is really the absence of injustice, or at least the relative reduction of injustice. And for me, what's kind of fascinating, but also sometimes depressing, is the ability of our societies to constantly throw up new kinds of injustice, new challenges, new problems to deal with. And that's maybe what we can talk about.
That's a fascinating way of describing it. The absence of justice is injustice, and that's what kind of angers people to take action. Going back to when you were a teenager, because a lot of the people watching will be young folk who've never sort of maybe got involved in organizations and might have just joined the first protest and march. They might have started volunteering, signed a petition. They're just starting this journey. I mean, what was it like for you as a teenager when you were angered? I mean, what was that specific moment? Could you describe it?
I'm not sure there was a moment, but it seemed to me, I could see power being hoarded. And I think in any society, power and privilege and money is hoarded. We had an official rhetoric. This is in Britain, which was that this was an open, democratic, free society. And then you see the transmission of unjustified privilege, and that got me angry. So my initial involvement as an activist was partly on race issues, because at that point, the far right was organizing very aggressively on the streets of Britain, getting support from mainly working class voters. And I then became part of organizing marches and protests and direct confrontation actually on the streets with the right. It was also the time Margaret Thatcher was in power. So one of the earliest projects I got involved in was getting young people on really government schemes and training schemes to join trade unions and to help them learn about the power they had. They appeared completely powerless, a 17-year-old without a job on a government scheme, but we helped them to see how they did actually have quite a bit of leverage and power, and how could you use that to get better conditions. So it was very kind of, I guess my upbringing was a very practical kind of activism where you had rather local challenges and you could see if you were succeeding or not.
You used the term power, really important word, which I guess we'll talk about in a bit, just in terms of how do you build power in order to make a difference on some of the issues you raised there. And I didn't know actually your kind of, in a way, genesis of your story kind of began with racism issues. I mean, for you now, what do you perceive to be the major social justice issues of our time?
There are too many.
Yeah, exactly.
And we've just been through an extraordinary surge of hoarding of wealth amongst the very, very rich. The last 10 or 20 years, the top 0.1% have become massively richer. It's a little bit the same thing happened in the late 19th century in the first and second waves of the Industrial Revolution. There are lots of global injustices between the rich world and the poor world. So this morning, one of the things I was working on is a project I'm doing with the Bangladesh government, a really interesting project about jobs and opportunities. 170 million people in Bangladesh. And in the global division of labor, if you're a garment worker in Bangladesh, you're not at the bottom, but you're fairly far down compared to a banker or indeed a professor in London. I just read an extraordinary book on the plane, which I would actually recommend to anyone seeing this, called The War of the Poor. Have you heard of this?
The War of the Poor?
Of the Poor.
No, I've never heard.
And it's an extraordinary history. It was very short, only 100 pages, very well written. And it's about basically the peasant revolts 500, 600, 700 years ago. There was one in England, a very famous one, when the peasants revolted and and killed lots of lawyers and aristocrats. This book mainly focuses on ones in Germany in the 16th century, where again, at a certain point, the poorest of society just said, we've had enough, took to the streets and the roads and literally killed the rich in large numbers. And it's an amazing book of just bringing to life how often people in the past didn't put up with oppression, unfairness, and injustice, though usually they were crushed. So in each of these cases, at a certain point, the kings, the emperors, with their professional armies and their mercenaries, essentially slaughtered them. But it's a reminder that sometimes justice does require very direct action. And as the other piece I read very recently, which I loved, was a piece on how the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 in Russia actually had a huge impact around the world as essentially elites decided to give concessions, particularly on worker rights and welfare, for fear that otherwise they would be put up against a wall and shot.
Fascinating, the fear of violence.
So, I not necessarily want to justify violence and murder, but sometimes you need that kind of threat. Otherwise, elites will just cling on to their power.
As you know, the mission of the School of Social Justice is to train the next generation of Martin Luther Kings.
Yeah.
MLK, of course, being somebody who strongly espoused peaceful means, but also was in conversation and direct conflict, but also in collaboration with Malcolm X, who at the time with the civil rights movement advocated for a different methodology, which was often less peaceful and more violent, the famous phrase being by any means necessary. I'd love to talk about kind of that in more depth in terms of peaceful versus violence and sort of modern day democratic means, but also we live in a world right now where there is war happening. Before we get into those methods and kind of the outlines of ways in which people can make a difference, I've got one final question just in terms of social justice. You talk about the 0.1% becoming more wealthier. We talk about the accumulation of wealth from those, or for those who are most privileged. Why should people even care about social justice? You spent your career looking at these issues. Like, what is it that has driven you to remain committed to addressing these things, over your whole career? Because some people might just be starting, they might have just retired and they think, actually, now's the time to give back. And others are saying, what's the point of caring? Because I've got my own issues to deal with. Why contribute to communities and societies and my neighborhoods? And what do you say to that question of why should people look at social injustice and do something about it?
I think, in a way, the basic insight of modern social science is that so many of the things which we think are personal, just about our life and our relationships and so on, are actually deeply shaped by structural forces. Your own opportunities to get a job, to get an income, to get a decent home, these are partly under your control, but to a degree they're shaped by structures and systems. And in a way, it's a sort of, it's a delusion to believe that you're in control, that your private life is the totality of your life. You're part of a system. I live in a town which is an interesting story of social justice, which is Luton, just north of London, is where I live. And we actually had a big gathering a couple of weeks ago of 600 people from across the town to talk about the town's strategy on social justice, looking to the year 2040. It's a relatively poor town. I used to have a very strong car industry, so it's had a high unemployment, lots of child poverty. It's a very racially diverse town, very large Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Indian background, but also from Eastern Europe and Africa and the Middle East. So very interesting and complex. It's the town which gave the world Andrew Tate, which is not necessarily something to be proud of. The England Defence League, a lot of teenagers went to fight for ISIS in Syria. And when I look at my neighbours, the people I share a town with, they say so much of their life chances are shaped by these bigger systems of justice or injustice. The fact that they may have a crappy house is partly because someone else, probably in London, is monopolising the housing market, accumulating wealth. Their pay levels are hugely shaped by structural forces. And one little piece of research which came out last week, which is very interesting from a social justice point of view, was a study looking at companies across, this was mainly the US, UK and Denmark, and showing if your CEO had done an MBA at Harvard or whatever, the pay levels of the workers were significantly lower than if they hadn't got an MBA. So this is where powerful ideologies, which is sort of anti-social justice, and in this case was the ideology which says if you're a business boss, your primary responsibility is to the shareholders, not to the workers. That led to very big reductions in pay for all the workers. Now, most of the workers aren't aware of that. They may think they're getting a pay level which is just what the market determines. But it's pieces of research like that which show you these are choices. These are political choices, often dressed up as business choices, but have a very material effect on millions of people's lives.
And I think a perfect and clear example of the power of education to shape what is deemed to be, in a way, morally good, worthwhile for focusing on and defining what success looks like. I mean, just that fact of the MBA and lower wages is rather shocking. And a reminder also of just the power of research to really understand the world we live in order to understand what kind of issues we want to address. I want to talk about academia in a bit more later, but let's take it back to the Labour government of 1997. You were head of the strategic unit, you were in government. What does it mean to be a leader within government? You've since, of course, advised governments all around the world. For people who are watching, you know, they're considering, do I take a career as a campaigner? Do I be an activist? Do I be a business leader who then contributes my profits and so forth to charitable causes I care about? Some might want to be politicians. Some might want to be strict business people and become philanthropists later. For those who want to be civil servants or SPADs and special advisors in government, I mean, what does that look like, and what are the levers of power there in terms of addressing social injustice?
So yeah, I mean, the personal choice, whether you go in the system, outside the system, and so on, is difficult and will vary greatly depending on the context you're in. In 1997, I was lucky. There was a government was elected with a big majority, a relatively stable economy. And I was brought in 97 to lead on social policy initially in the Prime Minister's team. And we were able to do quite a lot. I mean, it's sort of boring to describe them, but, you know, for example, youth unemployment was one of the priorities. And we created a big program called the New Deal, which over several years dramatically cut youth unemployment. I set up a thing called the Social Exclusion Unit to create a new way of working on issues like rough sleeping on the streets or teenage pregnancy. And we innovated in methods. So often we would involve young people in designing the policies. I was just describing in Australia, actually, which is returning to some of these points. We got lots of 13, 14-year-olds, 15, 16-year-olds living on poor estates to research what was happening in their lives and what needed to be done. And then they presented it to the cabinet and the Prime Minister, which was a very sort of fresh way of looking at social justice issues. It wasn't all through data or academics or big NGOs. There was a huge program on child poverty, which and a very large redistribution of resources. There were programs like on the early years, Sure Start for under fives. And what was really interesting is most of them, this is my academic side, we also spent money on evaluation to see what effect they would have. Unfortunately, most of those evaluations came out 10, 15 years later because these were quite long-term programs, but pretty much all of them had worked. That was what was extraordinary. You know, there were some short-term things like cutting street homelessness by 2/3 in 2 years. That was achieved, but also narrowing the gap between the poorest areas and the average, that was achieved. Big improvements in school performance in many of the poorest areas. Teenage pregnancy was halved. You know, that was again one of our goals. And in a way, the lesson I learned was that actually governments do have a lot of power.
Yes, yeah.
But almost everything they can do, and the one liner I sometimes use is they overestimate how much they can achieve short term, but underestimate how much they can achieve long term. So over 10 or 20 years, you can have an enormous impact on a society. Over 2 or 3 years, probably not very much. So the key is to create the political conditions, the bureaucratic conditions, the budgets for longer term programs. The other topic I worked a lot on, which I'm returning to now, is net zero, carbon reduction, climate change. I was responsible for really one of the UK's first sort of carbon reduction strategies. And the thing which really shocks people here, well, maybe I'll ask you, can you guess what happened to UK carbon emissions in the last 20 years?
I mean, my guess would that it's gone up.
Most people think it's gone up. It's gone down 50%.
Wow.
As the same is true in Denmark and quite a few other
50%.
countries. And people aren't even aware of it. And I think that's quite important for activists to realize. Often we're, I think, unrealistically fatalist. Like on climate change, people think, you know, God, it's getting worse every year. And it's true globally, the emissions are going up. And therefore, it's easy to conclude there's nothing we can do. The system is so powerful. It's so difficult to change. But in a number of countries, and there's about 20 or 30 countries, which had long-term policies. They shifted electricity to renewables, to wind power and solar and offshore wind. They've shifted their building rules and so on. You can, in a space of a generation, achieve dramatic improvements. And it's important to celebrate those because they're precisely why activism is worth doing. Government only had its net zero strategy then because there was a green movement lobbying for it, as well as engineers and scientists and business people coming together to achieve far-reaching change.
I mean, it's an example there of the need for all different types of people to get involved, and actually a reminder not one person can change something, but actually it's about that movement of people who might be disjointed, not speaking to each other, but each of whom are making a stab at trying to address these big problems. Cumulatively, it makes a difference. I mean, bring us into the very practical nature of governing. Like, what is it like what is it like, even when you're advising now, to be in those rooms? You know, very practical kind of insight into what it means to be influencing government. I mean, how did you, for example, come up with all of those issues to respond to? How did you formulate the responses? What does that day-to-day in the office look like for people who are just wondering, you know, I might not ever access government, but I dream to do so one day. Can Geoff give me an insight into what that life is really like?
I mean, it depends very much where you are. So I'd worked quite a lot with politicians. I worked before government with Gordon Brown, who later became essentially head of the finance function of British government, and with Tony Blair, who became Prime Minister for 10 years. And my role was slightly unusual, and I started off as a political advisor, but became a civil servant. So I would kind of bridge the bureaucracy and the political side. And I think often if you're in a government, you've got to think in several dimensions.
Okay, how so?
So for the politicians, spend half their time making speeches. They need a way of telling a story. They need a way of making, you know, dry stuff very visible and very vivid. And sometimes that's about individual life stories, but it's also about a bigger narrative of. That's why, for example, it's often easier to talk about child poverty than poverty, because most of the public are more sympathetic to children than they are necessarily to their parents, and that's part of the framing. Any kind of political program, you need a framing which has to be reasonably inclusive and graspable to lots of people.
So 50% of a politician's role is really to bring to life, as you said, those drives. I mean, that's a real interesting insight into what the real world of being a politician looks like.
There's a wonderful comment on Winston Churchill, I think by his deputy prime minister, Clement Attlee, who then later became prime minister. And he was asked, what did Winston Churchill do to win the Second World War? And Attlee said, talk about it. He wasn't very good at the details, but he was very good at talking about what had to be done, motivating people, keeping them focused. So that, anyway, there's a side of government which is basically communication and narrative. And then at the other end, it's very kind of crunchy stuff about budgets and laws and programs and people. And I'm slightly nerdily obsessed with this very dull stuff in a way.
Not dull stuff.
It is, no, it's objectively, it is quite dull.
Oh, really?
But if you're not willing to get into that world, you can't achieve change, because that's the, in a sense, that's the currency, that's the materials. It's like if you're an architect, you can have beautiful designs, but if you don't actually get to understand the materials and the energy and the practicalities, your buildings will be a bit disappointing. It will, leak the first time it rains.
So the details, the operations, the nuts and bolts of an operation.
Yeah. So I spend a lot of my time now working with governments around the world on the how, not just the what. Let's say the what of, let's say, improving mental health or children's opportunities, but the how, which is, as I say, it's about budgets, about capacities, it's about institutions, and so on. And so if you're getting into the system, you have to learn that. It's a craft skill, really, very, very practical.
Yeah. I mean, let's go into that. Yeah. What are those skills that are needed? You talked about how in politics, politicians who represent the constituents, and of course, being a politician is much more of a broader job description than that, but a large proportion is talking and, as you say, bringing to life these often dull issues. What are the skills that are needed there? and what are the skills to be great at what you do? So for example, somebody wants to follow you and your footsteps and be a future Geoff Mulgan. What are the skills on both sides that you think are necessary? In a way, what is the list of things that people need to develop in terms of developing their craft?
Well, I'd say that the ability to speak and convince and communicate is really important. And I always used to say the test of a good politician, but it's also actually true of often of people in other levels in the system, is can you walk into a hostile room and leave with them basically on your side and willing to understand what you're on about. Tony Blair used to sometimes say the skill he most wanted in civil servants was guile. And sometimes the ability to get round corners, and it may be just to diffuse a potential opposition or maybe to motivate your supporters. But any kind of change process is partly about weakening the enemy and strengthening your allies, and communication is part of that. In different governing contexts, there'll be very different things which are dominant. You know, you have to understand the machineries, the bureaucracies, how they work, and if you don't win them over, they will probably oppose you and block what you're trying to do. So again, you've got to have a bit of guile in understanding what motivates them. You've got to get hold of money. Money is the main currency in governments.
And how so?
It's the thing governments love announcing, you know, 100 million for this, $1 billion for that. It's what they fight over internally, most bitterly. You know, should a chunk of money go to, I don't know, build, you know, buy new fighter jets, or should it go to the schools, or should the prisons, or to building a new railway? And if you lose those battles and you don't have any money, you're not going to have much success on social justice, because social justice, in a way, only became part of the political agenda. I mean, before the late 19th century, nearly all government spending was on the military. And in some countries like Pakistan, it still is. Half of spending is the military. Russia still spends an incredible proportion of money on the military. And it was only when political activists lobbied for budgets to start going towards pensions and welfare payments and unemployment benefits and regeneration that you start getting a fairer society. So you've got to learn to play the money argument. I have a rather sort of, this is very nerdy stuff, one of the things I'm trying to work on is actually modernizing public finance, which is still very anachronistic in the ways it's organized. And this is very relevant to social justice. In pretty much every country in the world, if a government is spending money on a road or an airport, it's thought of as an investment. We spend, you know, $1 million this year, and this is the return we'll get over 30 or 40 years. When it comes to humans and spending on education or health or social security, it's treated as an annual spend. There's no investment methodology for looking at the returns you might get. Yet in social policy, if you do, let's say, spend a lot on under fives, their opportunities, you get an enormous payback, but it's over 20, 30, 40 years into the future. And so governments are often very myopic in relation to social stuff, very short-termist, whereas in relation to physical things, they're often quite sophisticated and looking at the long term.
And how then do you know, people who are watching try and win that argument? Do you have examples that you've seen, examples in history that show how you get resources and money from governments, from business, from philanthropists, from ordinary people to fund this work? I mean, at School of Social Justice, we are funded, we're a very small organization, we're funded mainly by philanthropists, grants, as well as small donations from patrons. Our work wouldn't be possible without them, because we're trying to do and deliver things which don't necessarily have a market value of doing entertaining conversations about Andrew Tate, who you mentioned before, or kind of the next boxing match between Jake Paul and Tyson Fury, Teddy Fury. So how do we win the argument for more money to be invested in this? I mean, you talk about ROI, return on investment, as one kind of framework. Do you have any other kind of observations there about how we bring more money in order to address these issues? Yeah,
so I think with any argument for social justice has to think about its framing, and there are lots of different options for the framing. Usually if it's just a pure social justice argument, that's not enough to convince people. So there's 3 or 4 other routes you can go. One which is very common around the world now is the argument that particularly investment in health and public health actually has a huge benefit for the economy as a whole. It pays off. And just about a half a mile from here was where the first ever mapping of cholera and infectious diseases was done by in Broad Street, just near there, which then persuaded governments to build sewage systems and water systems, which probably did as much for social justice as any other change in human history. But it was justified not just because it was good for the poor, but because it was actually helped the whole society be more prosperous. So there are some social justice arguments which can be framed in terms of overall prosperity, GDP, and the same is true of universal education can often be justified because everybody benefits if you have a more educated workforce. There are then much more sort of specialist arguments about returns on investment, and in recent years this has been much more common to show how if you divert people from a life of crime, again, there's a payback to the whole society. If you spend on early years education, you get a financial payback of 4 or 8 times better than you'll get on a road or a bridge or an airport. And I think it's important to try and mix these rather hard-nosed utilitarian economic arguments with a purely justice, moral, almost altruistic argument. You need as many cases, sort of ways of making a case as you possibly can. And in the face of a hard-nosed, cynical skeptic, is good to be able to use sometimes these cash arguments, as well as a pure rights argument as well.
Do you have an example actually of you when you've had to make the case for something, came up in front of a very big challenge, someone saying, no, this is not the way we should do things, and you winning the argument or overcoming that hurdle in order to achieve a particular form of change, whether it be a change in law, a new project being, because I think what's very helpful is to understand the best case scenarios, but what happens when things might not go as well, and how do you persevere in achieving what your goal is?
So a very live example, which I was looking at last night, prompted by my trip to Australia, was what's called justice reinvestment.
Okay, what's that?
So this really became an issue in the US, which was putting huge numbers of people into prison, mainly poor people.
Still the highest amount right now. Is that the case in terms of incarceration rates?
I'm not quite where they are now, but it certainly went up and up and up and up, partly driven by things like 3 strikes and you're out rules. Now, many people argued against that for all sorts of reasons. It was mainly black people being imprisoned. It was very unfair. It was deeply corrosive of society in so many ways, and often, prisons are schools of crime. But they also started looking at it from an economic point of view and showing that actually, if you took an area, could you spend money to dissuade people from being criminals, give them better jobs and better opportunities? And could you then show that overall the society would be better off because it would save on having to spend so much money running prisons, which are very expensive things? This was called justice reinvestment. There were some small-scale initiatives in the US tried showing this. The UK then about 10 or 12 years ago started doing experiments in justice reinvestment, particularly in the Northwest, in Manchester, Oldham. And in Australia, they're now sort of thinking about doing this on a larger scale, because it's a classic case where you can make the argument against mass imprisonment from a moral point of view or a common sense point of view. But in some ways, it's even more convincing. You can also show we will save billions of pounds or dollars if we prevent crime rather than just locking up thousands and thousands of mainly young people in hugely expensive facilities. So that's where this different kind of framing of an argument can unlock new resources, new ways of doing things.
That's a very kind of helpful example to see some of the challenges sometimes of trying to put something forward, but the need also for ingenuity, innovation, and new ideas to come up with different ways to address these problems. It's over time, and I'm very curious about you, the person, in the sense of, what does your day-to-day look like? How right now as a professor at UCL, do you go about your work, your craft, from waking up to getting ready, getting to the office? I mean, what does that look like? And I'd love to learn later a bit about your kind of learning methods personally, but kind of what does it mean to lead an organization now where you're at as an academic and as a professor?
At the moment, I've led organizations for most of the last 30 years, and I'm now in a sort of slightly free-floating space, but I don't actually run any team particularly. I work much more on projects. So today, my day began actually 7:30. We had a call with, it's a team in New Zealand we work with, who are the International Network of Government Scientists, which is a fascinating group of 100 countries, government scientists. We work with them on things like net zero and evidence. At 9, I had an event on this Bangladesh project where we're working on trying to reshape a whole system around job opportunities. And the team were in this room showing they've been scanning around the world what's being done in many, many countries, including the Philippines actually was shown, of methods of helping mobilize data and knowledge to help people make choices about their careers, their jobs and their skills, which is an absolutely fascinating field where the tech opportunities are completely different from 5 years ago. And countries like Bangladesh are leapfrogging the West, the developed world, in terms of what they're doing. And then I run this group called IPPO with our partners in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, where we're particularly looking at long COVID we were talking about just now. What have we learnt from, it looks like 500,000 people in Britain have dropped out of the workforce in the pandemic, partly perhaps because of things like long COVID or the hospitals failing to cure long-run diseases. And we've been doing a lot of work on mental health. And indeed, that relates to one of the things I want to sort of throw at you on social justice. And really, it's a question maybe for anyone in this field. In the sort of 50, 60 years ago was when the UK created its kind of welfare state. And then it was kind of assumed the needs of social justice were material ones. You provided people with a job, a decent income, a home, and it was kind of assumed lots of other stuff dealt with itself. About 12 years ago, as part of a project here in the UK looking at changing social needs, if we took a step back and asked what were the most pressing social needs now in the UK or a comparable country, some of those issues were still very live, like a decent home and a job and enough cash to buy food. But we were really struck by other things were almost as pressing, like loneliness, isolation, mental health issues, anxiety, depression, and so on. And yet those weren't part of the social justice, the welfare discourse of the 20th century. And I've become increasingly convinced, as it were, 21st century social justice takes well-being as seriously as material prosperity. It's how your psychological prosperity as well as the stuff you have. And yet our discourse, our policies have not caught up with this yet at all.
I totally agree. Listen, I've been writing a book. It's a memoir actually, reflecting on my own life and why I kind of, growing up in a working class background to Filipino immigrant parents who came here to work, as a chambermaid cleaning hotels in the Lake District and a waiter, why is it that later on I've dedicated my whole life to trying to address these social injustice issues? And in writing the book, I realized so much of this is about childhood trauma. My father passed away when I was 9 years old. It's about the mental health impacts of growing up in a place which has often had high crime rates and high poverty rates. And actually, the more I looked into it and writing about these events that happened, I was just shocked. I was like, why did I think as a child that carrying a knife was a good thing? Why did I think crime was a good thing? And then I think about all my role models that I was growing up with. Why did they think the same? And oftentimes it had to do with things that happened in childhood, which have stuck with them throughout the whole life. And of course, Freud would have a lot to say about this in terms of trauma in the past. I do think, and this might be a bold statement, politicians who have levers of power in terms of money, in terms of programs, in terms of reaching people and citizens across the whole nation, really needed. But in a way, psychologists, I feel, should have a larger role to play in our considerations for how we address some of these issues. Because oftentimes we say the personal is political. You got involved because you were angry. Sometimes people can't get involved because they've just gone through so much trauma and are mentally ill. And we also see the statistics, half of people, a large number of people, particularly men, commit suicide. I think it's still the largest killer of young men. And I think the stats are also significant for women too. So at the School of Social Justice, for myself as somebody who's been speaking to so many people, I've also seen social justice warriors, people commit to this. They've also got mental health issues that they're dealing with too. So I think generally and principally, I feel that before you try and save the world, you got to think about, looking internally and seeing what might have happened to you when you're young. And that's where psychologists come in. I could talk about this a long time. We're actually making a documentary about this as a rite of passage to becoming a change maker. Think about your own internal side. I will stop there because, it is a big thing, which I'd love to talk about more, maybe at another episode. But totally. I mean, but how did you come to that conclusion?
Well, just a little point. I absolutely agree with all you just said. And I think this is, in a way, how we will look at issues in a different way from 50 or 100 years ago, through that psychological lens. And it's partly, and it's often social change begins with seeing things in a new way. So the fact that such a high proportion of prisoners turn out to have had childhood trauma was not even visible 50 years ago. So it wasn't as part of people's mind map. There's a really interesting bit of data I was showing the other day, looking at murder patterns.
Okay.
What's the best predictor of someone murdering their partner, which is the most common form of murder? And it turns out it's signs that they were thinking of killing themselves, that violence against yourself is linked to violence against others. Now, that's a very surprising pattern. But once you know that, then you've got a different way of trying to get to the roots of problems. And my hope is this will become just obvious conventional wisdom in the future. Last year, we did hear a big sort of global review, and we called it population level mental health.
Okay.
What does the society do if it wants to help not just 1 or 2% of people with a really severe schizophrenia or depression, but actually 20 or 30% who may be struggling with anxiety and depression. And it opens up a completely different way of thinking about health services or about community support or about the family. And I think this will become a very big part of our politics in the next few decades. I've never heard a leading politician in this country say anything interesting about this topic, though. We're still not quite there. There's a gap between the mainstream language, which is all about ambulances and hospitals, and a lived reality where mental health is as important as physical health.
I mean, there is a stigma still attached to it. There were major politicians whose names I mentioned during the pandemic who did try to talk about mental health, but I'm sure those who briefed them were very careful about the impact it might have on the electoral chances, given the way still maybe these issues are stigmatized. One of my questions is whether or not you can be open as a politician about the things you face. And in that particular case, the politician had referred to other historic political leaders, from Winston Churchill to Abraham Lincoln, both who described almost the depression through symbols like the black dog, I think it was described as. And what I find very fascinating is, and I need to double check this fact, between the late 19th century and the Second World War, a large number of British prime ministers had lost a parent when they were a child. Why is that the case?
I didn't know that.
And I'm trying to remember where I read that, so I need to double check that. But clearly a link there of what it means to be a politician, maybe the love that you might not have got from a father or a mother, and you seeking that from the world.
From the public,
There you go. And they say hurt people. And I think that's where sometimes leadership can be dangerous, when if you're not really looking at why you're doing what you're doing, you could make bad decisions which impact many, many people.
So I hope our culture is changing a little bit on mental health. Different countries are different. In Norway, the Prime Minister resigned for a few months to handle his depression, then went back, and he's now running NATO, I think it is him. In Australia, several chief sort of premiers of states were very open about depression. Britain feels a little bit more backward in its political culture, and other countries much more backward, and you just can't talk about this at all. But the direction of travel, I think, is healthy. And as you say, it's so important for leaders to have self-knowledge, to invest a bit of time in self-knowledge. Otherwise, they inflict their traumas on the world. Yeah.
Jeff, you've touched upon an issue and a topic which I've been doing a lot of thinking with colleagues and writers and filmmakers and social justice activists and campaigners, and I'd love to speak with you about that in the future again. With only a few minutes remaining, I'm trying to think about what it is, if there was a student here sat with us, what would they ask if they got the chance to ask? One of the things, I guess, is around kind of the tips you would provide. Now, sometimes, okay, a list of tips, where does that go? But in a way, a list of tips for people is a starting point. Many of these people many of you who are watching are kind of starting their journey. And lists are one of those methods to kind of just get your mind to think in a very particular way about certain things. Do you have a list of kind of tips which you would share with aspiring change makers?
I haven't got a list.
Okay.
Maybe but it's a thought really, which may be I found useful, and I think others have. If you're dealing with any kind of social injustice, there's, as we start off in the conversation, there's a side of it which is very micro and very local. It's about maybe your own family, your own street, things you see every day. And there's another level of it which is kind of the world, the system, the structures. I find some very clever people get into the view that you can't change the very local stuff without changing the whole system. So they say, unless we overthrow capitalism, it's all a waste of time. And particularly in universities, you get quite a lot of that. And it becomes, at its extreme, an excuse for complete inaction, basically. I think it's an indulgence of and a lot of the intellectuals get into this space.
Classic ivory tower.
A pure ivory tower. There's another view which says, all you need to do is work on the very concrete, the very local, and be, as it were, blind to the system. That's almost equally bad. Yeah. And there are many traditions of charity which never talked about structures and systems and power, said it's only about giving a few quid to the guy on the street. So I think the challenge for I hope the next generation of activists on social justice is to, in some ways, constantly move between those different levels, to try and work practically in the world around you where you have some power, some influence, but always to be thinking about its implications for bigger systems and bigger structures, and are there ways you can be influencing politics or big business or the holders of money and power, and thinking of this as almost like two kinds of muscle. There's the system muscle and the very practical everyday muscle, and and exercising both of them, and they feed each other, and always avoiding, I say, the trap of going too far one way or the other. And it's kind of difficult, but I think it is vital to understand the interconnectedness of systems, but to use that as a fuel for action in the present, and not waiting for some dramatic change or a revolution which may never come.
And that's a great response, and great challenge also to people watching. Two last questions. One of the things or characteristics about you as a person that I've always respected and admired is your intelligence, and your ability, even sat across you now, to hear a question, hear a sentence, hear a word, and are able to kind of look at practical experience, things you've read, things you've seen, people you've spoken to and spoken about. How have you developed that intelligence? What is your process of learning? How have you got to a position where in your life you can be intelligent? I mean, it might sound like a silly question, but I guess lots of people figuring out how to improve themselves personally. How did you develop your, in a way, intelligence and all the other characteristics linked to that, without wanting to be too cheesy about it,
Well, probably two simple things, and maybe I've only worked this out over time. So one is hungry. I'm often just hungry for insights. So I read a lot of books. I like visiting projects. I like talking to people. I sort of try and suck in knowledge from others.
Interesting.
The rest of the world is far smarter than I am, so I'll benefit the more I can be constantly hungry, rather than believing I know the answers to things. And a couple of years ago, I was asked to write a piece on wisdom, actually for the Finnish government partly, which is a very interesting government. And the piece I wrote essentially had a very, very simple idea at its core, which I try and live on, which is the idea of a loop.
Okay.
That constantly in your life, try and predict what you think will happen. If I do X, this is what may happen. Observe what actually happened, which is probably different from what you expected, and then use that lesson to rethink your models, your mental frameworks. Now, as humans, we tend to do the opposite.
Okay.
We think something will happen. If the data doesn't fit, we just try and ignore it, and we stick to our beliefs regardless. And yet, I think wisdom is that constant, really, essentially, it's learning, adaptation in the light of real experience. Anyway, if you're interested, there's a much longer paper on what wisdom might mean. And a final thing I just want to mention, which we haven't talked about, which has been an obsession of mine in the last 2 or 3 years, partly because I thought it was something I wasn't doing very well, was imagination. And so about just before the pandemic, I was talking to a lot of activists, mainly the Friday school strike activists from around the world. And I was really struck by how pessimistic they were about the world. They thought we were basically doomed, and really struggled to articulate what could society look like that was better a generation or now from now. And then I talked to lots of leaders in different positions and found the same. They could picture the ecological disaster, the technology futures of AI and robots, but they couldn't say what would a better welfare state or health system or democracy look like in 2050 or 60. So I've started doing a lot of work on imagination and what are the methods for social and political imagination? How do we cultivate that? How do we organize it? And I've written now 2 books on this. One called Another World is Possible, and another one on art.
We'll be sure to share those.
Do please share those. And they're partly about, and I think it's very important for activists, change makers, to a little bit like what I said of linking the system stuff to the everyday, it's also linking the imaginative possibilities of a better world, 20, 30, 40, 50 years to the future, to what you do today. Because again, you can't really be an agent of change unless you've got some picture of what that change could be leading to. And for different reasons, our political parties, our universities, our institutions become much worse at that kind of organized imagination. And I think we need to really refuel our ability to picture what a better society could be like for our children and grandchildren.
I love that. Our vision at the School of Social Justice is to help create a world where anybody, no matter the background, can learn how to make a difference. And I think today's conversation is a perfect example of the importance of trying to capture people's wisdom and experience as you shared today, so that people around the world can learn a lot from it. I've learned so much. We have run out of time. My final question, and maybe you have a brief answer, is there may be people who watch this and go on to become leaders and have power. We mentioned power, but we haven't had the chance to talk about it in depth. What do you say to people who may find themselves in a position of power, particularly on the question of responsibility? Given all of the positions of power you've held, the powerful people you still advise and speak with and have advised, what do you say about that one little word, power? And of course, you can write books on this, but I'm just curious, do you have a final thought to share on that?
I mean, I've always been a backroom person. I don't really like being very public or visible. And I admire the people who go out and exercise power and take very visible positions of leadership. It's so important they have an ethical sense of responsibility, and usually that wanes the longer they are in power. So there's a bit of a self-knowledge to know your limits, which is why it's so interesting this year, seeing Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland, voluntarily give up power well ahead of when they needed to. That's very unusual, and is a symptom of a sense of responsibility. But there's also a little lesson which I always encourage, not just leaders, but also people in the civil services and so on, which I call triangulation. Make sure you invest quite a lot of your time, not just in seeing what you're doing top down, giving your speeches, passing your laws and your programs, but make sure somehow you're checking as it were, from the ground view up, whether what you think is happening is actually happening. So I used to get civil servants to go and visit, communities and schools and police stations and hospitals, and recheck whether the laws they'd passed had made any difference to the reality. And again, you would find what the centre of government thinks is happening isn't actually happening from the ground. And it's such a useful thing for leaders to do. It keeps you humble. Your risk in any position of leadership is you constantly hear the sound of your own voice, you see your own press releases, you're told you're wonderful by your colleagues because you're powerful, and you then so easily get a distorted picture of the reality you're trying to change. And the only way to check it is to say constant triangulation, double checking from the ground up what's actually happening. And that's a good way also of keeping you a bit more ethical and responsible.
Thank you, Geoff. There you have it. Make sure when you are in positions of power to check what the reality is and outside of your own bubble to make sure the change you seek is actually happening. Geoff, we could talk forever. I always enjoy our conversations. Thank you so much for your time and for your contributions. The School of Social Justice is so much stronger with your contribution, and I'm sure so many people out there will have learned so much, but also are intrigued to learn more. So as you said, there's your books, there's your lectures. I want to personally thank you for being there for me personally in my journey, and always supporting the work that myself and my colleagues have been doing, and look forward to continuing this conversation.
And one very final thought, which I guess is to all of you, apart from thanks to Alvin and good luck to you. My semi-mentor was a man called Michael Young, who you've heard of, who was a sort of social entrepreneur in Britain. One of the things he said, and I may have said this to you before, in any kind of change process, you will hit barriers and setbacks, and people will say no, and this won't work. He said, always take no as a question, not as an answer. If someone says no to you, don't treat that as the end of the matter. Treat it as a question for you to come back again with a better version, a better angle, a better argument. Don't be disheartened by the world saying no to you. It's bound to if you're trying to achieve change. Use that as an energizer, not as a demoralizer.
Wonderful final words. Thank you so much, Geoff, and
really
appreciate it.
Take care.
Take care.
This educational content is absolutely free. Why? Because our vision is a world where anybody, no matter their background, can learn how to make a difference. To keep going, we need your help. Can you become our next patron? Can you help us reach 2,500 patrons? I really hope so. Whatever the case, hope you learned something today, and sending you peace and love. Let's keep learning.